Hey retro gamers, today on Smashing Bricks we take on Count Dracula and all of his horrific minions in Castlevania for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Welcome to episode 10 of Smashing Bricks, a retro gaming podcast. My name is Eddie Inzauto, and today I'm here with a guest you haven't heard before on the show. But if you happen to be into board games, you may have heard of him. This is Mark Besada from the Board Game Barrage podcast, a board game expert and staunch advocate of Biblios, an
That's
auction
right.
and bidding game. How you doing, Mark?
Good. How are you?
Great. So welcome to Smashing Bricks. It's good to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. I have to say, though, so, people who have not listened to our show, there are 3/4 hosts, regular hosts, and two of the other regular hosts work in video games, literally work in the industry. And then you've got me, who literally has not played a video game with any regularity in years, and has not played video games like on a constant basis for probably a decade. And so you picked me of the three. So I've got to say I'm sort of concerned about your choosing of guests here. But if you had gotten a hold of me back in any time between 1986 and 1993, I would have been your guy for sure. But yeah, no, but I was happy to revisit my past here with Castlevania.
That's funny. In a way, then, you're actually more qualified because you are focused, hyper-focused even, on the era in question that I like to cover.
That's true. I like the way you think. That's absolutely true.
Also, Neilan will be on a future episode as a spoiler. Okay, so you want to tell us maybe a little bit about your show before we get started? Tell people who you are, what you do.
Sure, yeah. As you said, we do the Board Game Barrage podcast. So it's a podcast where we talk about, new and old board games, talk about different aspects of board game culture and board games in general. Started with me and a couple friends who would just have a weekly game night. And after playing a couple times, get board games with each other, thought to ourselves like, hey, this is sort of fun. And people seem to like reacting to the way we sort of do table talk and stuff like that, and decided to record a podcast. And it's sort of grown beyond our expectations for sure, from those first couple shows to now we're on something like episode 260. We've been going for like 5 years. So yeah, it's been fun. It's become a huge part of my life that I really enjoy. And yeah, I'd recommend it for anybody who is interested in board games whatsoever.
Very cool. And I do too, because I've listened to you guys now for probably 200 episodes, and I think you guys are great.
Thank you.
But that's board games.
Yeah.
My first love before getting into board games was video games, hence Smashing Bricks and retro games. So today, we're going to talk about an old game that was one of a short list that you gave me, that were games that you had some experience with, that you had some memories of. And this was actually the first one on your list, and one that I was very keen to revisit, or let's say visit for the first time, because I don't have a ton of experience with the Castlevania series.
Okay.
So,
and to be clear, I don't have a ton of experience with the series as well, aside from this game. So again, my window for video games is short, but this is like right in the middle of my window here.
Amazing. So, okay, so let's start off with a little bit of the history of the game, like we always do here on Smashing Bricks. This is Castlevania. This is a game that was developed and published by Konami originally for the Famicom Disk System in 1986, and then it came to the NES in 1987 in the US and 1988 in PAL regions, finally returning to Japan as a cartridge for the regular Famicom in 1993. So this one is really in that early-ish phase of the Nintendo era, which we've kind of been hitting a lot here on Smashing Bricks, which I guess is why you were listening. You told me you had been listening to a few episodes. Is that right? I was hitting a lot of the ones that you knew.
Metroid, I just listened to the Metroid episode a couple of weeks ago, and that's like prime Mark video game era. So yeah,
perfect. So this game was designed and produced by Akihiko Nagata and directed by Hitoshi Akimatsu, and it was actually originally known as I don't know how to say this, Akumajo Dracula or Devil's Castle Dracula when it first released in Japan. The name was then changed for the West because this sort of religious satanic illusion was not really going to fly in America, or at least not for the vice president of Konami of America. They just weren't comfortable with it. And they probably knew that Nintendo of America would not be comfortable with it. Because I don't know if you know that Nintendo of America, Nintendo of Japan was fine with a lot of sort of religious imagery in certain games. Zelda was one of them. But when games would come to the United States, they always took a lot of that out for the American market. It was pretty common then.
I didn't know that explicitly, but I had the sense, I'd heard and read that Nintendo was really like stringent about their quality control and what they would allow to get to their machines. So yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a lot of ways. This is just one way.
Right.
Another way actually relates to this game, relates to this company, Konami. So Konami was a big publisher back in the day. And they were so big that Nintendo had this rule where publishers were only allowed a certain number of titles on the Nintendo in a calendar year. Following the big video game crash of the early 1980s, they were very, very aware of the possibility of their system being flooded with garbage, essentially. So they limited these companies to publishing a certain amount so that the games would be held to a higher standard internally. And Konami actually sort of got a little pass on this, and they were able to make games under their Konami brand, their main name, and they also created another sort of subsidiary, but really just a brand within their company called Ultra Games, where you got some of the earlier, like the early Ninja Turtles, for example, was an Ultra game, and there were some other Ultra games. So this is Konami, but this was under their main label, Dracula, or whatever it's called, Castlevania.
And now, again, I'm a little out of the loop, but Konami now is no longer a big video game producer.
So as far as I know, Konami stopped really publishing games like they used to maybe in the mid 2010s.
Okay.
They definitely were huge in the NES era and the Super Nintendo era and even a couple of generations beyond that, but they kind of fizzled out.
Yeah, I certainly remember them from back then. But I've recently moved to Las Vegas, and I will say that there's a huge Konami, not storefront, but office building here. And I think what they do is now they produce, at least in Vegas and I'm sure elsewhere, a lot of like the gambling machines. So I think that's what they're doing now.
Yes, I believe that's definitely accurate because you're sparking my memory here with that. But, okay, so back in 1986, though, this guy, Hitoshi Akamatsu, he was the project director, but he was also a big cinemaphile, especially American films and classic American horror films. And he wanted to create a Nintendo game that was sort of similar to that, to give players that sort of vibe, a cinematic horror story. And he wanted to do as much as they could with what they had at the time in terms of the music, the visuals. And in fact, this game, the US release anyway, coincided with the 90th anniversary of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And even more so, if you look at the title screen, you may just, press start to go past it, but it's a film strip. You see the little holes on the top and the bottom of the screen like a piece of film.
Oh, I had never noticed that.
Yeah. And then, cool. I don't know if you finished the game. I certainly...
I did.
You did? Yeah. Oh, wow. Good for you. I could not get past a certain part, which we'll talk about in a while. But the credits are all references to horror movies. They're puns and plays on actor names and names that are tied to these classic films. They don't even have the staff names there.
Right.
It's really interesting. So it kind of ties it together as a movie. Another thing about this game, the main character uses a whip. That's the main thing. It's his magic whip, the vampire killer. And that is because this director of this game also loved Indiana Jones.
Oh, okay. Didn't know that.
So Castlevania really began as like a love letter to these films. Some other things about its development was, we'll get into what the game really is in a little bit, but originally they planned to make a lot of the gameplay a little bit more robust with more sub-weapons and the ability to strike the whip in various different directions. And some of these things got pulled back and didn't make it into the series until 1991 on the Super Nintendo. Also, the original Famicom Disk System game had a save system. So you could play the game and stop and not be like me, struggling on your infinite continues to try to beat a boss that you could never beat. You could save it, put it away, come back later, and try again, with fresh eyes and fingers. But that didn't make it onto the cartridge because the cartridge didn't have a battery backup at first, not until later on. So that's kind of the history. It came out at a time that was rife with a lot of development on the system because it was kind of after the original Nintendo games. You remember the black box games, like all the early Nintendo games?
Yes.
So they had those, and then just after that, we saw Castlevania. It was one of those games that was really soon after they transitioned away from that. And then it always felt like to me like there was a secondary era. Like there were sort of like three eras of the Nintendo. There's that early era where they were really basic games, then sort of a middle era where they started to learn how to develop for the system, and then a later era just before the Super Nintendo came out where they were doing incredible things, really pushing it to its limits.
Yes.
This was sort of on the cusp, or even just before the middle era.
Yeah, that feels right to me. Yeah, I remember those later games where felt like they were butting up against like how far the NES could go before the SNES came out, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you remember some of the games that were out at this time?
I remember for a number of reasons, I'm sure, but I remember Metroid being a game that is tied to this game to me. I have memories of. I have these weird memories of like Kid Icarus being a game I played right around here. And I played being sort of loose. I'll get into that a little bit later, but the person who played most of these games was my brother. I was sort of like the brains behind it, where he was actually the person playing it, but I would draw the maps and I'd be the guy reading the manuals and stuff like that. But yeah, I'd say Metroid. I'd say, is this like Mike Tyson Punch Out was a big game. I don't know if it's the same area. I feel like that, like Punch Out was
same
a
year
later
even.
than this. Oh, yeah. Was it? Oh, I didn't even know that. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. This just felt like the golden era of gaming for me, for young Mark, for sure.
Yeah, this was sort of like the breakout period of like
yes, exactly.
of the Nintendo really showing, oh wow, stuff's getting cool now. Because in 1987 there was a boom of games. I talked about this a little bit on the previous episode with Wizards and Warriors, but 1987 had Metroid, Zelda, Punch-Out, Mega Man. Just before this,
for sure, yeah.
Yeah, you love Mega Man. Everyone loves Mega Man. It's such a good series. Oh my god! If you don't love Mega Man, you probably didn't play it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. All I have to say about Mega Man for now. Yeah, this one also followed Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, which is super interesting because Capcom and Konami always felt like they had a rivalry in the early era. It was like Capcom did this, Konami did that. And this was sort of that situation. Ghosts and Goblins came out just a little bit before, and then Konami came back with Castlevania.
And Ghosts and Goblins has like a very, not a very, but there's a Castlevania Ghosts and Goblins sort of like shared vibe there, like the gothic sort of creepiness to them.
Definitely. There's a lot of similarities, like the way that they show the map in between, like you have an idea of where you're going. They're both meant to be horror. They're both meant to be pretty difficult. It's a real interesting early rivalry where two companies are really trying to fight for the same space there.
Right.
Other things that were notable to me, this predates the Ninja Gaiden series by like a year or so. And it's funny because Tecmo, that was a totally different company, they used almost the same exact sort of user interface, like the health bar on top and the sub weapon and the points. It's like almost identical. And it was so strange to me that it was the same stuff with two different companies. And a lot of similarities between the games. When we get into gameplay, I'll bring it up again. This also predates the original Ninja Turtles game, which I just mentioned earlier, which was another Konami title under Ultra, and they had some design and audiovisual similarities. So for me, as someone who played that game a ton as a kid, coming to this one now and remembering, thinking, oh wow, I see some of the lineage here.
Yeah, I played that one as well, and that hadn't occurred to me until you said it. But yeah, now thinking about it, the format does have a lot of similarities between the two games for sure.
Yeah, like the level layouts, some of the style of the tile sets, the graphical assets, and the music also is very similar in some ways. And it's so funny that you say that this game is so tied to Metroid, because of all the games that I was looking at when doing a little research for this that were sort of big games, Metroid was the one that was most in line with the Japanese release of this and the American release of this, of Castlevania. Huh. They were like really in lockstep. So maybe it was just a timing thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so as for its reception, originally when the game came out, it came out to really good reviews. One by Mark and his brother, another by CVG gave it an 80%, Famitsu 34 out of 40, and then later on there were a bunch of other versions, and many years later the Game Boy Advance version got a Metacritic score of 74% out of 100, and the Wii Virtual Console version, which is just the original redone, got a 71% in 2007, which was 20 years later. So After 20 years, it seems the critics cooled on it a little bit, but originally it was a big, a critical success. Finally, before we get into our own histories, we'll do a little bit about the legacy and re-releases. So after it was on the Nintendo, it did come out for the PlayChoice 10 and Nintendo Versus System arcade machines. Then there were ports on the Commodore 64 Amiga and MS-DOS in 1990, and those were sort of different versions, a little, not quite as robust as the original. There was a mobile version in 2002 in Japan, and 2004 in US and PAL regions, and then the Game Boy Advance had it in 2004. Konami's put it in a bunch of different series, like collections. They had the Konami Collectors series, Castlevania and Contra, which was a PC game in 2002. I said it came out on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007. It was on the NES Classic console in 2016. And most recently, part of the Castlevania Anniversary Collection for PC, Switch, Xbox One, and PS4 just 3 years ago in 2019.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's been re-released a bunch of times, and even more so, this game has a legacy of creating a long running series. There have been many games since then. I feel like I've been talking a lot. And so since I did that, maybe you can tell the listeners about some of the games that followed.
Yeah. As I mentioned, my video gaming window, especially with the NES and those early games, was quite small. And so I I was aware of sequels, but in doing some research about Castlevania, I was not aware of the sheer number of sequels. And, having revisited this original one made me want to go back. But so you've got Castlevania in 86, and then 87, which is the one sequel I remember, is Simon's Quest Castlevania 2. I remember I had a Nintendo Power subscription, and I remember the cover for Castlevania 2 for the Nintendo Power when it was the headlining game or the feature game. It was this guy dressed up in as Simon Belmont in this Centurion uniform, and he had Dracula's head. He was carrying Dracula's head. And I later found out that that was one of the most controversial covers because parents were upset that they had a guy carrying Dracula's head. Anyway, that was Castlevania 2 in 87, Haunted Castle in 88. Then we've got Castlevania 3 in 89, Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge in 91. So 2 Castlevania 2s. That's interesting.
I think Belmont's Revenge may have been a Game Boy game.
Okay. Super Castlevania 4 in 91, Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which rings a faint bell, but I don't think I've ever played it. Then Castlevania Bloodlines in 94 and Castlevania Dracula X in 95. So you've got a bunch right around there. Then Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is one I've definitely heard of, but again, never played.
That's actually one of the biggest ones in the series, and that sort of changed the direction. We'll talk about that in a little bit, actually.
Yeah. I would be very interested in hearing about that because that one definitely rings a bell. Then Castlevania Legends in 97 as well. 99 brought Castlevania on the Nintendo 64 and Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. And then 2001, Castlevania Circle of the Moon and Castlevania Chronicles. 2002, Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance, and followed by the next year by Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, which again is another one that rings a bell.
Yeah, that was a Game Boy Advance game.
Okay. And Castlevania Lament of Innocence. I gotta say, I'm a bigger fan of a lot of numbering these. The fact that these are all colon titles confuses an old man like me. Anyhow, 2005 we've got Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow and Castlevania Curse of Darkness. 2006 Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, which is one I've definitely never heard of because I would remember Portrait of Ruin. 2007 Dracula X Chronicles. 2008 Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. 2009 Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. 2010 Castlevania Lords of Shadow. 2013 is Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. And wrapping up with 2014 Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. So does the series end at 2014? I find that hard to believe. Have there not been any Castlevania since then?
As far as I know, that's where it ended. Okay. Imagine they announced one today. I think that would get a big rise out of the fans. Yeah,
I'm surprised that they haven't mined that in 8 years. That seems crazy to me.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, the incredible thing about this series is that it's been on basically every system. We've had it on the old systems. It's been on all the handhelds, all the PlayStations, Nintendo 64, all the Xboxes, the Wii, the Wii U. It's been on everything. Right. But maybe not the newest consoles, the PS5 and them.
Interesting. In a time where you see a lot of IP being, redone, in all forms of culture and stuff like that, to find out that Castlevania has been a little dormant, it seems shocking to me. It's interesting.
Yeah, just those collections really were more recent. Right. Anyway, so that's the history and legacy of the Castlevania series. And we already talked a little bit about our history, but let's get to it with a little bit more depth. I'll start because my history with this game was pretty minimal. I remember it being around. I remember knowing about it. I remember sampling the game. I don't know when or how or whose it was. It could have been one of my previous guests, George. He might have had that game. It could have been one of my old friends, Bobby, who I used to play video games with all the time. It could have been one of my previous guests, Anthony, who I used to play video games with. I remember trying the game, but it was never one that I sat down and played for a long time. So I was aware of it and was interested in it even, but just really never was able to get into it myself. And I only finally did fully play through a Castlevania game when it came to the Nintendo 64, which is widely considered one of the worst ones in the series. And it's interesting because there's this genre of games called Metroidvania games. And
Right,
I was
I've
fully
heard
aware of what a Metroid game is. And I was pretty sure I knew what a Castlevania game was. And they were not the same thing. But this is where Symphony of the Night comes in. So in 1997, the game Symphony of the Night came out on the PlayStation 1, and it became a sort of Metroid game where you had to attain items that would open up progress to different areas that was previously locked off, that style of game, whereas these old games were very much more straightforward.
Right.
So in my mind, I was like, what do you mean Metroidvania? Castlevania is a straight go from beginning to end game. And then I learned that apparently Symphony of the Night is like this, and later games have all been like that.
I'm with you 100% because even though I don't play video games very much anymore, like I still like to be in touch with video game culture because it was such a big part of my life in the past. And I'd heard this term Metroidvania a bunch of times, and I did not get it at all because, like you said, like they seem to be very different games. And later I heard that it's the idea of needing to acquire things in order to progress. And I figured it must have to do with one of the Castlevania sequels. So didn't really know it was the Symphony of the Night. So interesting to have that cleared up because I've heard that term tons of times.
Yeah. And apparently, I think that Symphony of the Night is the most lauded in the entire series.
Okay.
Also. So let's talk a little bit more about your history. You started telling us about it a little bit, but let's go into it some more. Where'd you get the game? How'd you, tell us everything.
Yeah, sure. So I can't say I remember the exact details, but if my history with Castlevania was like my history with other Nintendo games of the area, and it almost certainly was, I got it from a Toys R Us. That was almost certainly where we got it. And then the ritual was the same every time we got one of these Nintendo games. It was I was in the back seat. Like we had the game. We obviously opened it up immediately as soon as we got out of the store. And then my brother would hand me the manual because that's what I was interested in. And then he would sit, like I'd be sitting in the back seat reading the manual from cover to cover. And my little brother would be in the front seat, like with my dad, like just willing us to get home as quickly as possible. Like he would just be desperate that we got home. And I'd be in the back just like poring over the manual. I remember those manuals like so fondly. I loved those things. And then that would be whatever game we got would be just like our next week. It would be like, okay, this is now the project. Like we are going to be diving into this. And we would do this over and over again for a bunch of different games. Contra, I remember Akari Warriors, all these games was the same sort of thing. And the way it would happen would be like, I would read the manual, we'd get home, he'd pop it in, and like he was just way more proficient at these games than I was. But I was happy to be like sort of the guy like in the back, figuring things out, giving him pointers, help. Like there was always like a couple things I was good at. I was good at usually like important jumps. I remember that. Like if there was an important jump, he would often hand the controller to me. But when it came to like the fighting and the moving around and stuff like that, it was his game. But
you were like the proverbial guy in the chair.
Exactly.
To quote Spider-Man.
That was certainly me for sure.
Nice.
And yeah, I just remember playing this over and over and over again. I actually did not remember whether or not we had beat it because I just remember I still remember that we owned 42 games. It was like a point of pride for me as an elementary school and grade schooler that we had 42 games. But I remember that our success rate in beating these games was quite low. I don't remember like getting to the end of a lot of these games, and I did not remember whether or not we beat Castlevania. And then so I texted my brother to ask him, and he believes that we did. Like he seemed to remember like Dracula being the villain, and so I sent him some screenshots that I found on the internet. And he's like, yeah, we definitely beat that. So it was good to know that was one of our few conquests.
Awesome. Yeah, it's not the easiest game. Also not the hardest game, which we'll talk about in a bit. But so around how old were you when this game was in the zeitgeist?
So I would have been, because I think we probably got it right around release. So I would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 9, and he would have been 7. Okay. Although that feels way young, but that must have been the case. It must have been right around that.
Okay. No, that's definitely reasonable, because I was only born 3 years before this game came out, and it was still part of my world somehow.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So that's the history. You did beat it. You were the guy in the chair. You did the tough jumps. Nice.
Right. And I don't know if we want to get into the actual game right now, but I will say that I sort of lost touch with like gaming in general, but I figured that, I wanted to play this again because we were going to be talking about it, and my memories are a little foggy. And so I was like, okay, now I'm more experienced now. This was a game I was playing, I was struggling with as a kid, but now I'll be like, I'll get this. This will be easy. And turned it on and started playing. I'm like, oh my God, this is still super hard, still super difficult. And so I wanted to make sure that I beat it, but I had to like pull out all the stops. Like I was like having save like emulators that allow me to save game, and looking up like strategy stuff and cheats and all that stuff. But
you were determined.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but still super difficult for sure.
Nice. All right. Yeah, we could actually start talking about our entire playthrough here. First of all, we didn't really say what the game is. You want to explain to the audience exactly like what the game is, how it's set up, what you're faced with when you put it in and grab the controller?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess it be considered like a side scroller, right? Mm-hmm. And you're playing as Simon Belmont, although he's credited at the end of the game as Simon Belmondo. Is that right? Like I don't get that part.
I think that's another one of those. They changed all the names of the old actors, so they even changed their own fictional guy just for fun.
That's funny. Okay. But yeah, so it's a side scroller where you are trying to get through stages, each of them sort of capped off by a big boss, all of them out of, as you said, like horror movies or horror creatures, culminating with Dracula at the end. I think there are 5 bosses that you go through, but as you progress, you're using primarily your whip, but also you're picking up like special weapons that you can use as well, that work better and worse with different like enemies. Mm-hmm. And just progressing stage to stage. And I guess that's basically it. I'm sure I've missed a lot, but that strikes me as a basic summary of how it works.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's a lot of side scrolling. There's a little bit of verticality because it has the stairs that you go up and down. Yeah. So you have multiple levels on the same screen sometimes, and then you can scroll up to the next screen. But it's not really free flowing. It's pretty segmented in that way. You've got your whip, right? Your main weapon is the whip, the vampire killer, and you can hit your enemies with that, either forward or backward. You could jump and attack. You could duck and attack. All the sub-weapons you said. So this is one of the things I wanted to compare it to. A game that I played recently on the show was Ninja Gaiden, which was a game that came out a little bit later. It moved a little bit faster, but it had a lot of these same similarities where, like you said, you get items and points and sort of ammunition, you could call it, for your sub-weapons by knocking down all these candlesticks, the candelabras that were essentially attached to the background wall. That was like a common thing then. Same thing in the Ninja Gaiden games. There were all these things floating in the air that you had to jump and slice down to get your stuff. And in this game, those were the weapons, different point values, weapon upgrades.
I will say that I liked how for every special weapon you get, no matter what the special weapon is that you acquire, the ammo for it is like shared. So if you go from one weapon to the other, the ammo you have for one carries over to the one that you've now acquired that's replaced it. And for some reason, I always liked the fact that the ammo they were picking up were hearts. I don't know why, but it's sort of like tied to the whole Gothic thing. Like it was some sort of like life spirit that was, powering all these things. I loved how it was like, rather than like ammo boxes or whatever, it was just like it was like your spirit that was connecting all these things. While conversely, I sort of didn't like how points were what got you extra lives. I think that's exclusively how you get extra lives, by acquiring points. There's a lot of like money bags you can pick up that are points, and when you beat up enemies, you get points, and that's how you get extra lives. It sort of felt like a disconnect. Like you have this like hearts thing when it comes to like powering your weapons, but points are how you get extra lives. It felt like a little bit of a disconnect there for me.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like one is really trying to keep the ludonarrative consonants going, give you a reason for that being the thing, whereas points are just something that's completely outside of the fiction.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and those points, yeah, that's right. You get extra lives at 30,000 and then every 50,000 points thereafter, ad infinitum. What else? Oh, yeah, so I only discovered recently, and not even at the beginning of my play this time, how really important those sub-weapons are. You're really incentivized to use them. I think the developers wanted players to use them a lot, to rely on them, like it was part of the story almost, like that Simon Belmont had his vampire killer whip, but also needed all these other things to be successful, because there were sort of these background mechanisms in place that made it easier for you. For example, I learned this by reading a little walkthrough guide kind of at the end of my play, so I missed out on it throughout this play. But as you kill enemies with each sub-weapon, you gain more and more points for killing those enemies. Like you get bonus points for chaining together kills using the same sub-weapon.
Right. Yeah. In fact, the sub-weapons become stronger. They become more efficient. Like if you get, I think it's like 10 kills in a row with any sub-weapon, you'll get a drop where like it'll be like the numeral 2, and if you pick it up, then you can like fire two of the same sub-weapon, like one after the other, rather than waiting. And if you do it again, you get like a triple boost, so you can fire them off 3 at a time.
Yeah, and that's really cool. It definitely encourages you to kind of focus and even plan for what you want to have in order to get through a really hard part. Maybe, you'll see some other weapon drop and you'll deliberately skip over it so that you can hold on to your powered up, let's say your cross boomerang or whatever.
Right.
And then be able to throw multiples of those at enemies that are coming at you from both sides. And also the sub-weapons are important in that they're strong kind of against different enemies or enemy types, either just their intrinsic vulnerabilities to them or based on the physical way they approach you. Like, for example, the axe, you throw it in a big arc and there are some enemies that are flying. So the arc of that axe is really cool. It's also great for enemies that hold up shields, where if you hit them from the front, it takes, say, like 8 hits to kill them. Whereas if you hit them with the axe and it goes over their shield and lands on their head, it's far fewer hits. So it was way deeper than it appears at first. And that was super cool to me. I like that whole sub-weapon system.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Yeah, the fact that And I remember this this is one of the most like the strongest memories I have of playing the game originally when, we would struggle and struggle and struggle against these bosses. And then we would, luck into having a sub weapon at the time or figure, let's try this sub weapon on this boss. And all of a sudden it would go from being impossible to being like trivial. And it felt like we've thought this game, like we figured out how to beat this guy. And it was like a very joyous moment. Like when we would do that, like, wow, okay, now we know whenever we fight this guy, let's make sure to bring the firebomb sub weapon or whatever it is. And that was just like a great part of the game for sure.
Yeah. And that really speaks to the quality of the game design, because in previous games, let's talk about Ghosts and Goblins, for example. So in Ghosts and Goblins, you would get item drops from enemies, and that was one way to do it. But in Castlevania, they decided to tie them to these candelabras, so that allowed them to place things exactly where they wanted them, to give the players that experience, to make you feel like you got the thing that you needed to use in the right place, or to like set up sort of an experience for players. And I think that's really cool about this game. And I think if I played it for a much longer time, I would start to see a lot of the same things you're talking about, you remember with your brother. And that I've got to be certain that is all intentional in the design,
right?
Which is really cool
for sure.
So yeah, the game goes on. You have all these weapons. You go through all these different levels. In between levels, it shows the map. So it's very rudimentary, but it kind of gives you a general layout of where you are within the castle. And for me, it was hard to follow until I went back and played it a second time. I was like, oh, now I see what I'm doing. Did you like seeing that part?
I did. And yeah, and just like the fact that while the map is, as you said, like very rudimentary, just the idea that you see yourself progressing up the castle, and you've got Dracula at the very top, and that always felt like very aspirational, like when we were playing it as a kid, like okay, now we're at the top of the castle, and it felt momentous. It felt like it made that final level even a bigger deal, seeing that we're now at the top.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So my point eventually was going to be that the visuals of the levels while you're playing them, the actual levels, the backgrounds, the tiles, everything, that to me felt very much like they were creating a place. They were really driving home the setting. And as I played, I definitely felt the progress I was making. Like now I'm outside. Now I'm in the first tower. Oh, now I'm all the way up at the top. Oh, now I've been thrown down into the underground cave, and now I'm coming back out. I'm sneaking back into the castle in the back area, and I'm going through this other part. And they did that so well with the visuals, in my opinion. I really liked the details in the background and sort of the cohesiveness of the level sets, because there were 18 stages, but they were really divided into 6 like levels or areas with a boss at the end, and each one was subdivided into 3 separate little stages so that you could have a place to continue from. But within those levels, the set of 3, it was definitely a cohesive theme, and you felt like you were in a particular place trying to get to a particular place, on your way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What'd you feel about the graphics themselves? Like, did you feel like they were very good? Or actually, this is important to think about. Like, what do you remember feeling about the graphics back then, and now looking back at them, how do you feel about it?
I remember really liking the graphics when we first got it. I remember just the fact that there were so many different things represented, and again, just the whole thing is evocative graphically. And this is not even to talk about the music, which one of the biggest surprises I had playing the game this latest time was how evocative and how much I remembered the music. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later, but and even going back to it now, again, this is probably a big function of me not playing video games nowadays, because honestly, like I couldn't even like tell you how graphically sophisticated games were now, because I just don't play them very often. But because I still have like that era of video games being like my era of video games, they still felt good. I mean, obviously, you don't have that much fidelity, but it still felt evocative. It still felt like I was in a castle rather than I'm just like watching these sprites move around. So it still worked for me at least.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I really felt impressed by the presentation, both visually and the audio. Like you said, the music was fantastic. What did you want to say about the music?
Playing this again, I obviously had memories of it, and as an aside, like one thing that really pleasantly surprised me was as soon as I started playing, before I looked at the manual or anything, I immediately for some reason had this muscle memory of how to actually use the sub weapons, which is not it's not just a button, like you have to push up and attack to use them, and I instantly knew that. It was just a fun sort of thing that came to me that I hadn't been expecting. But another thing that I hadn't been expecting was just how ingrained that music was, because if you had asked me before the game, before I played it again just now, what Castlevania music was, I would not have been able to pick it out. But as soon as it started playing, like I just started getting flooded by these memories and these feelings of being back then, and just really again evocative of the game and of the mood it's trying to set. And I just think it really worked out. It's very like there's like it really provides like an ambiance to the game and really brings out that whole gothic feeling to it for me.
Yeah, for real. I found, I don't know specifically because I didn't really take very detailed notes about the music, but there were times when I felt like the music was very driving, and it was a time in the game where I felt like I really had to hurry up to get past some of these more difficult parts and get to the next level. And then there were other parts where it was a little bit more suspenseful, and that area felt that way as a whole also. Or when I was down in the underground, it just felt oppressive, that sort of thing.
Yes.
It really all came together for me too. So one more thing I wanted to say is that when we were talking about the map and the aspirational nature of it, did you notice that halfway through the game, you go through, I think, 6 levels or 6 stages, and just before you reach the boss that plunges you down into the depths again,
right,
you see Dracula's tower in the background before you go into the foreground tower to fight the boss that you're currently at. So
I had not noticed that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Because it's very iconic in a way. It's up this stairway, kind of isolated in the sky, up and to the left. And then when you get to it later in the game, you get there by going up this big staircase up and to the left and into this one little sort of tower. And that's definitely it that you see. And then if you look at the map, you can see that they are kind of close to each other. And I thought that was just so good, the way that they did that.
Yeah, that's very cool. That is
really thoughtful.
That had not come together. Yeah, that's very cool.
So speaking of bosses, what did you think of the bosses on the way to Dracula?
So as I said, like, it's funny because if you had asked me this, I know this comes off as sounding ridiculous, but if you'd asked me before I played this game, like, how long do you think it's going to take you to beat Castlevania? Like, how long would it take?
Mm-hmm.
I would have guessed, and again, this is I'm admitting up front that it's ridiculous, but I would have thought, okay, this is like a 20-hour game or whatever, which is crazy. I understand now in retrospect that is a crazy thing to say, because but although if I had tried to play this straight and legit, like, it would have taken me, I would not have been able to do it because it's just so difficult. But I found that, so I tried to play it legit initially and just was like getting destroyed. I just did not have it. But as you mentioned earlier, like, reading some tips and stuff like that, it's pretty clear that if you have the right sub weapons with the different bosses, like, they can be pretty easy to beat. Although that was not my recollection as a kid, because I do remember playing these bosses back in the late 80s and just like I I just remember like when we would get to a boss, it was like we all had to go quiet. Like if friends were over or something like that, we would all go quiet, and it was like, okay, we have to focus now. Like this is like a team effort. We have to do this, and it would be this like event. But yeah, now that I've read these guides and stuff like that, like these bosses that were insurmountable back then, if you have the right sub weapon, you can really catch them and tie them down. So I have both sides to the difficulty now in my brain, like the insurmountable playing back then as a kid to now like learning, oh, if you've got this, you're probably gonna be okay to progress. And now I guess you can beat the game fairly easily in like under an hour, which is crazy to me. That blows my mind because this was like a game where we would pour over from like waking up to going to sleep as kids, like for days and days and days and days at a time, and it's often not beat. But yeah, it just blew me away.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think that's pretty common with these old games. When you were a kid, you spent all that time and you died a lot. And now realizing, oh, it's a pretty short game is so funny. I also found that it was a lot faster than I expected without the previous experience of the game. I just figured, oh, an average game might be, X number of hours. And then I started playing, and I was just playing pretty honestly straight through. And I got to a certain point, and I was like, man, I'm on level 11 or whatever I'm at. I wonder how many levels there are. So I looked it up and said, oh, wow, I'm pretty close to the end. But then I actually couldn't finish the game. I got up to the second to last boss and couldn't beat him because I couldn't get to him with enough health to be able to soak up the damage that he was giving me. And that was, who was that? The Grim Reaper, who floats around and has numerous little spiraling scythes bouncing around the screen. And I had to avoid, 4 different things plus him, plus actually make attacks on him. And I kind of gave up. But that was pretty far, level 15 or stage 15. But I agree that the early ones were not so tough for me, as an adult playing it for the first time. The first one, I think probably when you said you think there are 5, you probably didn't even consider the first one a boss. There was that bat, because the bats become regular enemies all the way in the 6th area, which is funny. But I like the design of these bosses, like the Medusa head in the 2nd area who floats around and kind of like flashes and looks really creepy.
Right.
The 2 mummies, and they all have kind of a little intro to them. Like the bat is up on the ceiling and he's just waiting there for you until you get in, and then all of a sudden he drops down, and the Medusa head is part of a statue in the background among these beautiful windows in the background in this room, and the mummies just look like statues on either end of their room.
Right. Yeah. You jump between the mummies and then they come at you. Like they just become live. And
like a trap. Like you've triggered a trap where the walls close on you or something. The only ones that really felt like you get in there and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is a fight for me, were the Frankenstein monster. He was just waiting there to attack. And then, of course, Death, or the Grim Reaper. Again, I didn't get to Count Dracula, although I did watch afterward to see what it was like. And he actually looked less difficult than the Grim Reaper felt to me. Is that accurate?
Well, if memory serves, I think I'm right about this, but the Grim Reaper, I think that's the level where if you can carry the holy water the entire time and get to him with that, he's actually pretty straightforward. Like you can just sort of spam him with the holy water / firebomb, I guess it's called, and he's actually not too difficult.
I bet they changed that for North America, actually, holy water.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It was probably holy water, and they probably changed it to firebomb, because that's what it says in the manual, right?
Yeah.
Clearly not fire. Okay, yeah, I felt like that 5th area was just so hard. Did you have any favorite parts or least favorite parts, or parts that were really memorable that you got stuck on, or parts that you loved doing?
I remember I think it's the 3rd level where the hunchbacks are introduced where there are these little
Yeah.
hunched over characters that jump around, and I guess they're nicknamed by people who play Castlevania like flea men because they bounce around like fleas. And I just remember them being overwhelming and just really being frustrated when I was a kid playing them. And even now they're really difficult. Even with all the cheating I was doing, they're really tough to deal with. And I guess there were crows who I think they're in the 5th level or 5th stage or whatever. They sort of float above you and dive bomb you at weird angles, and they sort of seem very random in their movement and tough to sort of get your arms around in terms of how to defeat them. You have to nip them in the bud and get them on timing early on. So those are the two most memorable minions for sure for me.
Yeah, okay, so those were the two that are the most erratic in their movements, like they don't follow a pattern as much. Those hunchbacks are really annoying. The ravens were less of a deal for me because they move really slowly, and sometimes they just kind of like pause and don't try to hit you, and then you just walk past them or whatever. Yeah.
You can sort of like, when they start hovering above you, you can sort of just like walk, and they'll basically sort of leave you alone and fly away often.
Yeah. For me, it was whenever the Medusa heads that go in kind of like a sine wave were not when they were there by themselves so much, although when they first showed up in, I guess, level 2 even?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, it was like stage 5 or something. First they show up and you just have solid ground under you, and they hit me a bunch, and I was like, okay, I know what they do now. I can dodge them. I can jump or just wait, whatever. And then you go up and they're there where you have holes in the ground and you can fall to your death, and it's an instant loss of a life. That was really bothersome early on. And then later on, they added those Medusa heads with other enemies at the same time. And that's like the big thing in that 5th area leading up to the Grim Reaper. They had the Axemen who are throwing axes, and they have their big shields up, so they take a lot of hits. But also these Medusa heads coming from both sides.
Right.
God, that just wrecked me, and that's where I couldn't get past.
And you mentioned the jumping. One thing, I sort of consulted with my brother to see what he remembered about the game. And the first thing he said when I brought up Castlevania was the jumping being really difficult. Like I guess we played this and one of the Marios, and just the difference. He said he remembered very vividly how different it was going from Castlevania to like the Mario Brothers games in terms of like the jumping.
Yeah, from stiff to like free and smooth.
Yeah. It's almost like your character Simon in the game is like jumping with like rocks in his pockets, because it's like he always feels like he thuds from one jump to another. Like he lands very stiffly, like very. And I know you were a fan of. It sort of reminded me of you talking about the Luigi jump versus the Toad jump in a previous episode, where Simon feels like a very Toady sort of jump. Like he sticks every landing. I think you talked about that with Toad.
Yeah, I do like sticking the landing, but there's something more about Simon Belmont. Is just everything is like pretty stiff with him. Like either jump straight up and straight down. Every jump is a commitment, and there's zero adjustment after all. Like in the air, in some games you can adjust. For example, in Metroid, you're adjusting a little bit all the time. In every Mario game, you can adjust a little bit. But in this, once you've jumped, whatever amount of commitment you put on the forward motion of that jump or the backward motion, that's it. You're in. Right.
Also, I remember knockback in this game being pretty substantial. Like when you get hit, you really fly back a distance.
Yep. Right into a hole.
Right.
Usually.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So speaking of the difficulty of certain sort of gauntlets throughout the game, you would hit parts that were easy, then hit parts that are really hard. But there was no obvious way to get your health back, right? How did we get our health back in this game?
There were the drops. What kind of? It was like the prototypical look like meat on a bone sort of things.
Yeah,
what were
pork
they
chop.
called? They were pork chops. Yes, pork chops.
Also known as wall meat.
Right, right. I think that's probably the only. And then whenever you beat a boss, I guess they're called magic crystals would drop, and you get all your health back for the next level.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
yeah, I think there's only two ways. Yeah,
Yeah, but
very
so
rare.
so where did we get the pork chops from though?
Yeah, it's funny. This game has a bunch of like secret spots. Like with the pork chops, it was often pretty straightforward. Like there would be what appeared to be like a couple like bricks or something, or part of a wall, and you would hit it, and all of a sudden it would crack, and pork chop would drop out of nowhere. But this game really struck me for how many like secrets seem to be completely outside of like the course of normal gameplay. And I remember actually finding one of them as a kid, but in cheating my way through the game this last time and looking at some walkthroughs and stuff like that, there were ones like where you'd have to like break a brick to access like an otherwise inaccessible part of the level, and then you'd have to stand on a certain brick and then kneel, and then that would spring up like a treasure on the other side of the screen. It's like, who's going to just find this? Who's going to like break this brick, decide they're going to go down there, and then decide to kneel on a certain location to find it? And there's a lot of spots like that in this game. Fortunately, none of them are really required. In fact, I was looking at a playthrough, and I guess there's a treasure you can trigger by doing something like a kneel or standing in one spot for a number of seconds. That will spring a treasure up that is literally inaccessible. Like it causes this treasure to pop up on the side of the screen, and you just cannot get to it. So just that sort of struck me as like emblematic of the secrets in the game. Like just so hard to find. Like how would anybody just playing the game find a lot of these things? Just struck me as interesting and funny.
Yeah, that is crazy, because I found one of these things playing through just normally. It's a little treasure chest that's sort of like shining or glowing that pops up just seemingly at random. And I was like, oh, I'll go get this. And it was just points. I think it might have been a lot of points. I don't know.
Yeah, I think most of these are points. Most of them are treasures with points. Some occasionally you get a pork chop, but usually they're just points, yeah.
Yeah, but then I also read about there being a lot of these, and you just said there are a lot of them. Do you know approximately how many are in the game?
I don't like if memory serves, somewhere in the neighborhood of like it is a substantial number, something like 20.
Oh
something
my
like
God.
That, 20. Yeah, there's quite a few, but
only 18
again, most of
levels.
them are just yeah, right. Yeah, it strikes me as about one a level, give or take. But again, these are mostly points. You're mostly getting points for them, so they don't. If you miss them, it's not a big deal. But still, just like they're so out of the way.
Right. Yeah, man, that would be fun to go through and try to get all of them. It would be interesting if they develop this game out, or if they have developed this game out in the following titles to add to that system, to make it so that there were necessary ones that you had to get, but also make them a little bit more sensible in the way that you get them, so that it all tied together a little bit more.
Although if there's one thing I know about Castlevania 2, and I literally may only know one thing about it, it's that it was quite inaccessible. If I remember correctly, it's like the translations were really difficult, where it would even lead players astray based on what the characters were saying, because the translations weren't accurate. So I just remember hearing from friends who got Castlevania 2, like really them being really excited about it, and then hearing afterwards on the playground, like, wow, this game is like really complicated and we don't even know what we're doing. And so that's why I never picked it up, because I just remember a lot of bad word of mouth on the playground.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try it after this. I'm going to jump in and play some more of these Castlevania games like you suggested. I have a couple more questions for you. These are more like fun things. What was your favorite sub-weapon?
My favorite sub-weapon, probably the boomerang. Although I also like the watch. The watch was really cool. The fact that you could stop time. I'd probably would go with the watch if I had to pick one. Because the boomerang, like, it's not so far away from the dagger, which is like it strikes me as the basic sub-weapon, which is just you just shoot a dagger straight. The boomerang obviously comes back to you and can hit enemies like 2 times, which is cool. But the watch is something like that sort of like kind of blew my mind as a kid. Like, okay, the game is going to stop and you're going to be the one person like moving around. It's sort of like really, really cool idea.
Yeah, I actually wrote something down about the watch that I wanted to mention, is that the inclusion of that as a sub-weapon seems pretty smart to me from a design perspective, because of the programming of the game. that has somewhat awkward respawning rules. It's not one of the worst games as far as respawning, like, for example, Ninja Gaiden or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, where you move a millimeter and everything respawns again at the edge of the screen.
Right.
But this game did have a lot of those sorts of respawns, and having the watch to stop time kind of was a way to temper that sort of problem, and that was great.
Right.
And I liked using it a lot too for certain areas. My favorite weapon was probably the boomerang
Don't
cross.
say the axe.
No,
Okay.
the boomerang cross. I did like the axe at first.
You like the axe?
Yeah, I mean, it's
I-
really strong. It could take out the
Yeah.
flying enemies. One of my most hated parts of the game, or maybe not hated, but just another part that I struggled with a lot, was at the end of area 4, after you come up out of the underground and into sort of like that courtyard area before getting back into the castle. There are eagles that drop the hunchbacks from the sky from both directions, and there are Medusa heads flying all at one time.
Right.
So having an axe right there would have been wonderful. I found myself wishing for the axe.
Sure.
But I think that cross is definitely my favorite. Although the holy water, really good, really strong.
I really like that too.
Stopped
That's
enemies
probably
from coming. That one's cool in that it stunned people. You know, like they would stop moving when they got hit by that one and get hit multiple times.
of all the sort of like quote unquote boss cheats, like most of them came down to make sure you have the holy water against the boss and you'll be good. So it was quite strong for those occasions as well.
But also kind of rare as far as the weapons went, right?
Right.
Another question I had for you was, you talked about the enemies you liked the least. Did you have a standard enemy whose design you thought was the most interesting or the most fun or the coolest or the best?
I was a fan of like I guess they're called the Skeledragons, which are the dragons that are like emerged from the walls, and they sort of have like a serpentine body, and they're connected to the wall, but they sort of like move up and down like a snake. Those always struck me as cool looking, and I think also the fact that they're fairly easy to beat, and each one of their vertebrae,
helps.
each one of the vertebrae like gives you a drop, so they're also like pretty bountiful when you beat them. So that was another thing I enjoyed about them. But yeah, whenever I came across a Skeledragon, I was happy.
Cool. Yeah, I liked the design of the majority of the enemies sort of visually, and I think that
Yeah,
they had a
for
good
sure.
variety of the way they worked, even if I hated some of them. Like the Axeman I thought was really cool, but I just did not like fighting him.
One that I did not like fighting, and I thought the design wasn't great, actually, was the Ghost. It's like a skeleton head in like a ball of fire, but it's not only, if it was just a skeleton head and a ball of fire, it'd be one thing, but it's got these like weird appendages at the bottom of the head.
Yeah.
And it just like sort of struck me as odd, but still creepy. I mean, definitely creepy.
And that enemy was a little annoying because it was like the flying enemies, except it tracked
Right.
you wherever you went really slowly and like painfully.
Yeah, could get out of hand for sure.
I really liked the white skeletons, basically the Hammer
Yeah.
Brothers.
Yeah,
I thought they were
the way
fun.
they sort of collapse when you beat them. Yeah.
Okay, so final thoughts here. I've been trying to figure out a way to give sort of a conclusive rating on each of these games. Like, should listeners go play it? So, my question to you is this. Would you call Castlevania more of a smash or more of a brick?
This is so hard for me to answer because just the nostalgia of it paints it so much for me. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this for the general listening public. For me, it was a smash.
Okay.
But that was also with with cheating my guts out when I played it. It's really difficult, but it is very evocative. Obviously, video games have progressed a ton since this came out. But I would say certainly if you ever played this game in the past, like if you're a kid like me who was like growing up in like the late 80s and had the NES, like loved revisiting this for sure, but I would find it very hard to recommend this to somebody who didn't have the nostalgia. I mean, I guess if you're a fan of video games and you are like a person who, thinks of themselves as like a historian or somebody who wants to like dig back into these older games, which most of your listeners probably are, then yeah, certainly I feel like there's got to be a lot of things to be gained from going back and checking it out. But, a really tough game, a game where I can see people getting frustrated, but yeah, I loved it. I thought it was a smash for sure.
All right, I'm gonna agree with you a little bit more conclusively. I think the combination of the design, as far as gameplay, the visuals, the music, the fact that it came out when it did and is still of the quality that it is, the fact that it is the progenitor of this long legacy of games, and I had a lot of fun playing it. I liked the way the weapons worked, I liked the way the enemies worked, I liked the way the levels came together, I liked the cohesiveness of the narrative. I'm going to say, yeah, I recommend this one.
Nice.
I say this one's worth replaying too. So that's going to be the final word. 2 thumbs up from our 2
perfect
reviewers here. And that's going to be, I think that's how I'm going to do things moving forward, listeners. If even one of the 2 people on the show says it's not worth playing, then it doesn't get approved. But since the 2 of us did, we're going to mark this one off as worth revisiting.
Stringent guidelines. I like that.
Yeah.
High bars.
Not even a single dissenting opinion is allowed. And that's it. So thanks so much for coming on and talking about this game with me, Mark. It's been great.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on, like, and giving me the opportunity to revisit this. Like, if it not for you, I would likely never have gone back and played this, and getting a chance to go back and playing it, and again, just all these, like, to be like completely frank, all these like emotions that hit me when I started playing it, and the music and all this stuff. And then, even chatting with my brother about it was a thrill, just talking about when we were kids. It was just all a just totally, totally wonderful experience. And I'm definitely going to go back and at the very least, like, look into the other games in the Castlevania series, because I'm now very, very curious as to where it went. So this was a total pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. And that's really the point, right? So starting the podcast, that was the point, is to get myself to replay games that I want to play and have like a reason to go back, and to give the opportunity to the listeners to play the games along with us and be ready to revisit them, physically playing them, and then have the discussion about them also.
Right.
So anyone who's listening, I also want to encourage you to reach out with any games that you think should be played on future episodes. A game that maybe you played as a kid and want to see that you want to replay now and would like to hear about on the podcast, anything like that. Just send an email to smashingbrickspodcast@gmail.com. Say whatever games. I'm also going to have a link to the Smashing Bricks Retro Games list. Has about 400 games on it as of right now, but even though that sounds like a large number, that is really nothing as far as the history of video gaming is concerned, because this covers everything from 2002 and earlier. So anything 20 years old or older is eligible for this list. So send me your ideas and I'll put them on, and I will link that list in the show notes. Finally, I guess, Mark, tell the listeners exactly where they should be going to find you before you sign off.
Yeah, they can likely find our show wherever you found this show. So whatever pod catching device that I don't know if they're called pod catching devices, but that's what I'm going to call them. But wherever you find your podcasts, look up Board Game Barrage and you will find us there. And you can also find us at boardgamebarrage.com. Those are the ways to find us. Nice and easy, nice and standard. So yeah.
Beautiful. And as for Smashing Bricks, you know the deal. Search Smashing Bricks on any social media platform. I particularly prefer Instagram @Smashing Bricks. Also Twitter @Smashing_Bricks. smashing_bricks. And of course, anchor.fm/smashingbricks if you want to find the main page for the podcast if you found us some other way. As for the next episode, keep an eye on our Instagram, and once again, I'll be announcing my next guest and next game there shortly after this episode lands in your pod-catching devices. Thank you, and you're welcome, Mark. It's great talking to you.
Same.
And to everyone listening, thank you for listening. I'm Eddie Inzauto for Mark Besada. This has been Smashing Bricks, a retro gaming podcast. And until next time, may the nostalgia be with you.